In looking back over my old videos and some of the comments they received, I think I may have gotten ahead of myself in one very important topic that I didn't quite introduce properly. Well, okay, I didn't introduce a lot of topics properly. But there's one in particular that I mention a lot that I never really gave a proper explanation to, so I thought I'd give a very short, very basic introduction to what I call kinesthetics. Which it turns out is mostly an adventure through etymology. Yeah, it's gonna be one of those boring academic episodes, so buckle up. Outside of the context of video games, kinesthetics is kinda but not really synonymous with proprioception. That is, the sense of your body's position and movements relative to one another. It's one of the senses outside of the traditional five. It lets us move around without being dependent on sight, sound, or even touch. It's what lets you type without looking at the keyboard, walk with your eyes closed, or talk without looking at your lips. The origin of the term stems from an 1880 paper by British neurologist Henry Charlton Bastian, where he suggested a sense of movement to replace the more static muscle sense that had dominated the concept of proprioception in the field until that point. He dubbed the sense of movement kinesthesia, because that's exactly what the word means. The sense of motion. Yeah, you know this. Video games have always had some level of kinesthetic input. Unless you actually have to look at your hands while playing, it's one of the primary senses we use to interact with games. But upon the arrival of Guitar Hero and the Wii, the traditional definition of kinesthetics became relevant to the medium in a way it hadn't been since the halcyon days of arcade games and their wacky inputs. These new games emphasize the difference between hitting a button to swing a baseball bat and swinging your arms to hit that home run, or the difference between playing Parappa the Rapper with your controller and actually singing in Rock Band. Designers were engineering kinesthetic sensations into their games, and it fundamentally changed the way games felt to play. And while these sorts of games brought an exaggerated kinesthetic sensation to the medium, games have always had a kinesthetic design element to them. Ask any Street Fighter player if the sensation of playing Blanca, with all of his backwards charge moves, feels any different on their fingers than playing Zangief, who has a lot of moves that are a lot of circles and punches. But really what I mean when I use the term kinesthetics was covered far more eloquently by Steve Swink in his book Game Feel, which, as far as I'm aware, is one of, if not the only book on the subject. In the book, Swink attempts to dissect what he calls game feel, the sensation of games, that intangible feedback loop that plants itself in our brains when we play. It's the physical sensation of manipulating an input to play the game, but enhanced by all of the audio-visual feedback the game provides and a strong sense of firmness and rigidity from the game's underlying collision and physics systems. The end result is an illusion that gives you the impression of physically manipulating a virtual object. Despite it being digital, you feel its weight, and its friction, and its momentum. It's where the sense of tight driving controls, precise jumping physics, and satisfying combat mechanics come from. It's why this feels so good. And this feels sort of puny. It's the reason the simple act of playing Super Meat Boy is so rewarding, and why taking down hordes of orcs and space marines is visceral and cathartic. And like all game design tools, it can be subverted to wonderful effect. A really loose, muted game feel is exactly what keeps the polynomial feeling so distant and serene. And the floaty, wobbly sense of feedback in Grand Theft Auto 4 when driving drunk hammers home the fact that you're hammered.
Corporate America, that's freedom. Independence FM.
Swink acknowledges that kinesthetic sensation, like that in the Wii or Guitar Hero, or even the simple movement of your thumb on the analog stick, contributes to an overall sense of game feel. In an interactive medium, it is, after all, the final connection in a tight feedback loop which keeps you feeling involved, your bridge to the experience. So really, when I use the term kinesthetics, it's really more of a bastardized version of a single part of a greater construct that doesn't really have a name yet. Does that make my word choice appropriate? Well, no, not really. But we're talking about a young medium, and terminology is getting invented and reinvented year by year and even day by day. I mean, we've yet to develop a proper medium-wide definition for emergent gameplay other than that it exists. Or look at the term social games. It primarily describes the business model for these games more than the games themselves, but despite the general inaccuracy of the term, it seems to have stuck. And if you want to talk about the granddaddy of bullshit terminology pulled out of thin air, gamification takes the cake. But that's another episode. While I love Swink's book, I find the term game feel to be unwieldy. The phrase kinesthetically pleasing to me has a far better ring than this game has really good game feel. And by Swink's own admission, his game feel is part of interacting with any system, not just games. Game feel exists outside of video games, driving cars, riding bikes, and so on, but nowhere is it so refined, pure, and malleable. Steve Swink, game feel. As a result, I'm not sure game feel is the term we should be using. Granted, I'm sure Swink chose that term specifically to avoid the type of sloganeering I'm being accused of. Regardless, I find myself compelled to describe game feel as a virtual kinesthetic sense, literally for lack of a better word. Plus there's a little bit of wordplay going on there. Yes, it's the sense of movement, but there's also this implicit idea that it's an avenue for aesthetic design in the philosophy of art sense. Despite being so core to our experience of play, kinesthetics are low on the radar to most people, and often ignored as a pet peeve of the hardcore who will go to great lengths to fix the polling frequency of mouse drivers just to stop their games from feeling off. But just because some players are more sensitive to the concept than others doesn't make kinesthetics unimportant, and it doesn't mean the concepts aren't worth discussing. They're a fundamental aspect of any game, even for games where feel is not an obvious concern. StarCraft 2 is a great traditional GUI-driven game, but if the response of the clicks or the mouse cursor is delayed by even 100 milliseconds, players start to feel subconsciously divided from the experience. Too often do we see game developers relying on Skinner-box-style mechanics in order to make up for a lack of depth in core mechanics that can be reflected in kinesthetic feedback. We need more games that derive fundamental pleasure from their core mechanics, that encourage intrinsic reward for system exploration and mastery, that reward play for play's sake. But whatever you want to call it, game feel, kinesthetics, or just a bunch of loose constructs like tight controls or loose steering, the sensation the games give us when playing them is very real. It's comparable to the way songs can be catchy or architecture can flow well. It stimulates some dark part of our brains that gives us pleasure, and it's one more tool developers can manipulate to design their games. You know how pictures can be superficially pretty to make a really ugly point?
Oh, she's beautiful. The girl is very pretty, and your first reaction is, oh, what a happy teenager. But maybe that's not the whole story. Maybe that prettiness comes at a price.
Or how songs can use crazy catchiness to hammer home a reprise?
It's a piece of cake to bake a pretty cake. If the way is hazy.
I look forward to the day when we understand enough about how a game's feedback loop is pleasurable to players to achieve similar goals, regardless of what it's called at the time.